Okay. Francis McCracken, your middle name?
Irvin.
Irvin. And your wife Karen?
Karen Ray
Karen Ray, who's
Jorgensen McCracken. Married May 16th, 1959. In
1959.
Stillwater, Oklahoma, at the Salem Lutheran Church.
Correct.
Seems like a long time ago, doesn't it? 47.5 years. Yeah.
It's been a while.
Been a while. We got 2 sons. Kelly.
Working on 50.
Working on 50. 2 sons. Kelly John McCracken, and he's was born January 23rd, 1964. And then we have Alan Francis McCracken, born November 30th, 1966. They both live in Arizona. Kelly lives in Tempe, and he's married to Aline McCracken, and they've been married just 3 years, 3.5 years. First marriage for both. She's an only child. And then Alan isn't married. Anything else? Retired.
So there's not going to be a lot of McCrackens on your side.
No, I think we're no grandkids. I don't think they're too old. They're in their 40s, and they can't have any, I think.
Right. And you were raised in Nebraska. What town?
Born and raised in Paxton, Nebraska, Keith County. Grandparents came from Denmark in 1883 and settled outside of North Platte, Paxton. And I'm the youngest of the 25 grandchildren that was born to my grandmother and grandfather Jorgensen. Have one brother, Bob, and he lives in Peoria, Arizona. He's a retired Air Force lieutenant colonel. So, what else? What about your work, dear?
I need you checking the camera.
I may have,
No, we're not eating.
may have been talking for nothing here.
Okay. Are we centered okay?
Got us
Okay,
all.
and then Francis, you were,
How about your school?
well, let's go. My father was Herman McCracken,
Right.
and his father was Leslie McCracken, and then your father was,
Irvin McCracken.
and Leslie and Irvin
We're brothers.
brothers. Okay, and
So you guys are second cousins.
I never could figure that out, but I'll accept it.
I think it's second, yeah, because Herman would be your first cousin.
Yeah. Right.
Okay.
And so then it's second or whatever you call it.
Ever how
Once
you divide
removed.
it up.
Right. And you grew up around the Vincennes area?
Well, partly. I was there till about 6th grade at Fritchton, a little town outside of Vincennes.
Mm-hmm.
Was born in Bicknell, Indiana in 1935. My mother's people were in coal mining.
Okay.
And worked those mines around Bicknell.
Okay. Right.
Her name.
And her name is Mildred Weiniger McCracken.
You're an only child.
Yeah, I was the only child. I guess I was born during the Depression, and they didn't have many children.
Not then. No, I couldn't
They
afford
said
it.
that. That's
Couldn't afford it. And Dad was played basketball till he came down with tuberculosis. Lost one lung in that disease, and we moved out to Arizona. Dad was sick a lot of times with this humidity and the cold here in Indiana, and wasn't able to work all that much. And we got to Arizona. I don't think he missed a day's work the rest of his life.
And
So
lived
to
to
the
be
climate.
over 90.
Yeah. Okay. And he's a jovial man, as I remember.
Yeah.
Had a typical McCracken smile. I think it was McCracken
Yeah,
smile.
part of the time, except when dealing with me.
For some reason, you brought out the.
Yeah.
The better anyway.
Well, they moved to Arizona. I spent time with your folks
Francis
there
gets
at West Bay.
Yeah, Muckham Holler.
Yeah.
Peaceful place, wasn't it?
Well,
Right.
it seemed like it. I remember the creek coming up and couldn't get to school for.
That's not all bad. Because the creek was between you and the road, wasn't it?
Right, still is.
Yeah. And
So your folks came and got you after they got settled in Arizona, and when they moved in 1946, it was like, where do we live out there? There's no housing it was so rural that's why they left you here with
Tried to
Leslie
get
and
settled
Ethel.
after the war because
Mm-hmm.
if you got sugar at that time, it was out of Mexico and it had a bunch of leaves and stems in it.
No.
Meat was hard to come by. You had
Mhm.
to stand in line. Things like this.
No tires to get out there.
No
right?
tires to get out there. Dad had a 35 Ford that wouldn't stay in gear, and over the mountains he went. Mom would hold it in gear.
Mm-hmm.
And water out when
Oh
like
yeah,
the radiator.
and that Ford always overheated, so we was digging water out of cattle ponds or whatever all the way to Arizona
Uh-huh.
to put water in that radiator. Well, it was all clogged up by the time we got there.
I would
Get
imagine
so
so.
emotional about this.
Well, I remember Paul talking about going to see his mom and dad there in the Vincennes area during the Depression era. And they had a model whatever. And he talking about those mud roads he had to travel on. It'd be several days to get there and back just to visit.
Yeah.
Back during the 20s and 30s. And talking about how number of times he had to change the tires because the tires weren't very good back then.
Right.
And it was quite an ordeal to go from West Baden to Vincennes.
And then to take off to Arizona, you can imagine.
Would have been quite a trip.
In 46?
46 or yeah, 46.
46.
Yeah.
You were 10, or 10 and a half, or whatever.
Yeah, about 10 years old.
6th grade.
Way behind in school when I got to Arizona.
Kind of a weak student when you got there. Now he's got a PhD degree, so
That's what I was saying.
he's a Dr. McCracken. I said about his
all the brains that concentrated in just a few. In forestry, is that not right? Is that it?
Yeah, it was in plant diseases, but ended up working in forestry
Okay.
plant
in
pathology.
Mississippi. And then when we retired from Mississippi, we went back to Arizona. So that's sort of a caption on my existence.
And your mother was Florrie?
Mildred.
Mildred.
And your
Weininger.
okay. Weininger. And then your grandmother was Flossie?
No. Grandmother, you mean Weininger grandmother?
No, on the McCracken side.
Oh,
Josie.
Josie.
Josie, yes.
Josie McCracken.
Yes.
John and
And
Josie.
great grandmother was
Julie.
Julie Ann, married to William Francis McCracken.
William
Okay.
Francis.
Well, I remember talking with Josie when she lived at Grandma and Paul's.
Yeah. After Grandpa died,
Yes.
she went up and lived with you folks.
Yes. And I wish I'd remembered more. I wish I'd asked more. But she talked about covering as a child. They came from the East Coast on a covered wagon to Indiana.
Right, and to about the town of Fridgeton, right around there, because they took up residence in an old log house. And the Indians were still attacking and causing some problem.
Is
around
that
there.
right?
And there were gun ports, I remember that, in the attic of that old log house. They were about that big.
I'll be.
And that would be the old Thompson place that Harry Manning now owns.
Okay, and they would have came here in what period of time? Do you have any idea?
I don't know.
She said it was either before or after the Civil War, and I can't remember.
Well, I think it was before the Civil War.
Well, that would make sense because I asked her, why did you leave? Because I asked her about the trip. It took months. And she told me they came from Virginia. There were farmers there. So, and this was, and you had an important piece of the puzzle. They came all the way to Indiana when this was a wilderness. Talking about Indians still there, had gun ports in their log cabin. And I asked her why they came. He says, because my mom and dad couldn't compete against slave labor. That's what she told me. In other words, the slaves basically worked for nothing. And if you're poor and you're a small farmer, you couldn't compete against slave.
Couldn't make a living out of it.
You couldn't make a living, compete against slave labor. Now that's what she told me. And that's all I remember.
And that's Josie.
Yes.
Yeah, Josie McCracken.
Well, the reason why I figured it was pre-Civil War is because William Francis fought as a soldier in the Civil War.
Yes.
and probably wasn't married at that time. Then when he mustered out, he had the opportunity to quote homestead or buy or bequeath land to him, and that's how they ended up at West Baden.
Right.
He staked out land at
Now that was
William Francis.
William Francis.
right.
With
And
the
then
10 kids.
and had the 10 boys. I can't swear to the correctness to that, but that's
Right.
what some of the stories
Okay.
were.
Well, see, Josie would have came from, was that,
Wilson.
yeah, she was a Wilson at that time, and when she came from Virginia's.
And her brother was Sylvester.
Because that's right, she called Virginia's.
Virginia's.
Yeah, they came from Virginia's.
Okay,
Did you know that?
I didn't know that.
Well, that's my memory, what she said.
Yeah.
And so she would have been a Wilson when she came.
Before she married McCracken.
Yeah.
And what'd you say? She had
Well,
a brother, Sylvester.
Sylvester Wilson. And I don't know anything about that side of the family. That was
Okay.
her brother. And someplace I have some pictures of them, and they were pretty good looking people when they were young.
Mm-hmm.
And she lived to be almost 90. She lacked a couple of weeks, I think, of being 90. She died in 1960 because we were married 6 months, and they sent us a telegram saying that she had died, Bergen's mother.
When I was a kid, we lived across the road from her. And she would entertain me with making cutouts of animals and things out of paper. And I know that she had played for the Methodist Church up around Paola or West Baden. When
Played
she
the piano?
Piano. She was the music. But I never heard her play anything when I was around her. Of course, she always had another dish on the table because I'd come across the road and sit down with them.
And she'd probably glad to have the company.
Probably so.
So your dad then was a farmer, so to speak?
No, not really. Dad had tuberculosis. Was in a sanitarium there in Indiana
When he was born.
when I was born.
Oh.
And when he got out of that situation, what did he do? He worked at Crane Ammunition Dump during the war. So he was up there as a safety inspector or something of this nature. And prior to that, I think he worked with building roads and bridges there in southern Indiana. But he was sick quite a bit because he only had one lung at that time.
Mm-hmm. That's back when TB was fatal.
Fatal, yeah, near fatal.
And he
So then-
survived.
Yeah, and lived to be 90. And then when he went to Phoenix,
Yeah, I remember telling Dad that there's chicken farms in the area where they have their house now. And he said,
oh, you mean in Phoenix?
yeah, he says, if I only bought, that they wanted to sell me his chicken ranch. Quite a few acres, like 100 there near the Camel Mountain.
Camelback.
Yeah. It's in that area right there.
Oh, he would have been a molten.
That's what he said I'd have made up for it. He said, but why I didn't want no chickens?
I'm not sure there was any chickens there. There was a lot of cactus. I went out, he picked me up one day and he said, let's go out and look at this Paradise Valley. They were selling some of that land. I think it was 50 cents an acre.
Mm-hmm.
And we looked at it and I said, Dad, it'll never amount to nothing. It's the ugliest desert I've ever saw in my life. Today, how about $500,000 a lot?
A lot. That's not an acre.
Just maybe an acre.
Maybe an acre. Yeah. He could have been from 50 cents to 500,000.
In Phoenix, he worked.
Yeah, in Phoenix he worked for Reynolds Aluminum. Basically all the time he was there as worked with the chemistry in the aluminum plant.